Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and students, friends, thank you for being patient with all the schedule changes and all the wirings and everything. Thank you very much to Professor Wolkenstein and to Professor Ayşe Çağlar. And yes, indeed, we have come to the end of this series, but I guess like most philosophers, I feel as if at the end, I'm only just beginning. I really need to go to the beginning, and you may know this. Now, the material I'm going to present today is actually new for me as well. It's an attempt to try to think through one of the major crises of our times. Call it climate change, call it the ecology crisis, call it whatever you wish. And if critical theory is to be understood as critical reflection on our times, it's an old phrase that comes also from Marx himself, I think that it's also incumbent upon us as critical theorists to try to engage with this new literature. So we'll see how this goes. I look forward to your comments. In my previous two lectures, I have defended a version of cosmopolitanism, which takes into account critiques of this position, whether voiced by postcolonial or decolonial thinkers. I have argued that it is possible to reformulate some insights of the Kantian tradition by rejecting the dualistic ontological hierarchy on which Kantian ethics is based, and by expanding Kant's understanding of cosmopolitan law in the light of the contributions of 12 scholars, third world scholars of international law. This was discussed in the second lecture. Then I introduced the standpoint of communicative ethics, which has been something I have worked on, a position I've worked on in many different texts. I said communicative ethics defends an interactive universalism in which the standpoint of the other is not only taken into account in thought, as Kant and following him, Hannah Arendt articulated in their formulation of the erweiterte Denkungsart. Rather, interactive universalism seeks the real-life encounter with the other through the cultivation of common practices and the creation of a shared world. I've called this approach cosmopolitan interdependence, which envisages embedding democratic self-determination in a new law of interdependent sovereignties. In today's lecture, I begin by exploring the various meanings of the term globe, as invoked in phrases such as neoliberal globalization, global warming, the global economy, etc. I will suggest that the term globe conflates the various meanings ranging from world to or earth to planet, world or earth and planet. As Dipesh Chakrabarty has emphasized, distinguishing these dimensions is essential for understanding the Anthropocene, that new epoch we have entered in the evolution of the planet. And as Bruno Latour has urged upon us, the membrane, the thin membrane surrounding the planet, what he calls Gaia, or the terrestrial, is what makes human and other forms of life possible in the first place. What kind of politics, then, are possible in the planetary age? Whereas historically, cosmopolitanism confronted the demos with the cosmos, understood by the ancient Greeks as a rational order comprehensible by reason, and reformulated by Kant as the world which we humans must peacefully share. The reality of the Anthropocene confronts members of the demo in the 21st century to think of themselves, or with the challenge of thinking of themselves as cohabitants of the Earth, of the planet. My argument will be that despite their eye-opening contributions, Chakrabarty and Latour tend towards a certain apocalypticism, which is impatient with politics. The concept of planetary in Chakrabarty's work and that of the terrestrial in Latour's slide from description into an ontology of what they call the deep earth. The prescriptive and political consequences of this slide are quite unclear. In some historical forms of deep earth politics, such as those of Martin Heidegger and Carl Schmitt, the political consequences are far from salutary. I will then turn in the second part of my lecture to Hannah Arendt and Karl Jaspers, who in the 1950s confronted the dangers the world faced with the invention of the atom bomb. Their reflections bear great significance for our own times, in that they show how humanity faced an unprecedented danger then too, but was nonetheless able to build institutions to counteract it. Arendt in particular worried that the negative solidarity of impending doom created by the atomic age may not succeed in leading to a worldly politics, but nonetheless she insisted that human beings would be able to create new institutions. Now, having started these lecture series nearly 10 days ago with Albert Hirschman, I will conclude with him. As one of the earliest critics of the industrial growth model, based on the extensive use of fossil fuels, Hirschman, I will argue, contributed to alternative visions of a planetary and cosmopolitan future. Okay, Anthropocene, globe, and planet. Through his influential work on the climate of history in a planetary age, Dipesh Chakrabarty has opened new vistas for the humanities as they encounter the new earth sciences. He quotes the Nobel Prize-winning theorist Paul Crutzen and his collaborator Eugene Sturmer, a marine science specialist, and I'm sure many of you do know this. For the past 3 centuries, the effects of humans on the global environment has escalated. It seems appropriate to assign the term Anthropocene to the present human-dominated geological epoch, supplementing the Holocene, the warm period of the past 10 to 12 millennia. This date also happens to coincide with James Watt's design of the steam engine in 1784 and before. As with any account of periodization, there are controversies about these dates as well. But the science of climate change, which supports the Anthropocene theory, is summarized in the 2007 fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, of the UN, and it is well established. What are the implications of the Anthropocene for the humanities and the social sciences? First, the origins of the Anthropocene period and the rise of modernity coincide. Because, as Chakrabarty puts it provocatively, quote, the mansion of modern freedoms stands on an ever-expanding foundation of fossil fuel use. Second, some scholars object that it's not modernity as such, but rather capitalist globalization, which has speeded up the depletion of the world's resources through an insatiable use of fuel fossils which produce greenhouse gases. According to Nancy Fraser, capitalism treats nature both as a source of extraction we take from nature, and also as a dumpster, as a garbage bag. We throw our waste into nature. Nature, she writes, is thought of as a collection of stuff devoid of value. But at the same time, nature is the means to the system of value expansion. Okay. Chakrabarty counters that the Anthropocene cannot be viewed as a consequence of capitalist globalization alone, since the scientists who advocate the idea of the Anthropocene are saying something quite to the contrary. Quote, they argue that because humans constitute a particular kind of species, as opposed to other species in nature, they can, in the process of dominating other species, themselves become a geologic force. This is the novum in the theory of the Anthropocene, that humans have now interfered in this process in an unprecedented, and many say irreversible way. Surely Chakrabarty is correct to point out that the project of industrial growth and expansion of greenhouse gas emissions by state capitalist countries, such as China, is no less wedded to the depletion of nature than our capitalist economies. But Fraser is also correct that historically, the process of primitive accumulation unleashed by early capitalism in every part of the world spread industrial capitalism globally and furthered the exploitation of nature. At stake in this discussion are issues of global distributive justice on a fragile planet with increasingly scarce resources such as water and arable land. While developing countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, the Caribbean, and other island nations rightly object that their carbon footprint over the centuries is much more limited than that of the industrial West and North, they point out that they are also the ones who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change because of their limited technological and economic capabilities. Can such conflicts be dealt with in terms of redistributionist, market-driven politics as advocated by neoliberal globalists, such as carbon gas trade, for example? Or can we deal with it by incremental reductions in carbon use promised by national governments via the various COP agreements, but which they hardly ever live up to? Do we need a more fundamental reorientation in our thinking? Chakrabarty believes that such a fundamental reorientation is essential. And in the third place, he argues that the science of climate change urges us to view humanity as a species, rather than as composed of distinct peoples with their own histories, cultures, and trajectories. Yet, can human history be thought of as species history? Doesn't such a perspective obfuscate distinctions between the powerful and the weak, the poor and the rich, the nations whose footprint on the surface of the planet are responsible for fuel emissions, and those who have barely begun to feed all their hungry masses? There are two distinct questions here. What does it mean to write the history of humanity as a species? And if such a history were to be written, would it not obfuscate politics, since it would speak in the name of some non-existent, as yet non-existent human unity called the human species? Chakrabarty is aware of the tremendous change in political thought that the answer to these two questions would entail. He suggests that we are faced with two connected but divergent conceptual tasks to rethink the globe and the planet. With the former, he says, that is, the globe, remains a humanocentric construction, and the latter decentering the human in our narratives of the world. The meanings of globe, then, for him in phrases such as global capitalism and global warming are not the same. Whereas the global, in the first case, refers, quote, to the human-dominated order that European empires, post-colonial and modernizing nationalisms, and capitalist and consumerist globalization created over the last 500 years, right? In the second phrase, global warming, he says, the globe means the planet, a new historical philosophical entity studied by the Earth system scientists. Not only are these meanings distinct, but the planet, or the standpoint of the Earth system, decenters the human. Now, let me ask, what are the implications of these theses for the cosmopolitanism I've been defending in these lectures? Doesn't cosmopolitanism remain totally entrapped in a humanocentric conception? Let us recall that the Greek Stoics, who identified the cosmos with reason, nous, did not think of such nature as the ontological other of humanity. Descartes' vision of rendering us maîtres et possesseurs de la nature was not technologically imaginable yet for the ancient Greeks. Nous was a form of mindfulness in accordance with nature. Even for Aristotle, that much maligned old master of dualist ontology, the movement of the heavens presented an image of eternity in which mind contemplating itself could only approximate. Mind and the cosmos mirrored each other. For the much dismissed Kant as well, there is an important distinction between the Welt und der Erdkugel. His political cosmopolitanism envisages the building of institutions in a world which we share with others. But one of the moments of ethical realization that leads us towards cosmopolitanism is the recognition that because the surface of the Earth is spherical, we cannot extend on it indefinitely. Sooner or later, we will encounter beings like ourselves with whom we must learn to share the surface. The sharing with others of the surface of the Earth could form the missing link between worldly cosmopolitanism and a new politics of planetary interdependence. Now, before turning to the dimension of globality, which I'm calling world, I'm going to dig a little deeper into Latour and the conversation between Chakrabarti and Latour. And I'm going to try to drink some water. Bruno Latour's work has revolutionized further our understanding of climate change by pointing out that climate change is far too narrow a term for the tremendous transformations afoot and does not confront the epochal or reorientation in thinking which Chakrabarti calls for. Whereas for Chakrabarti, however, planetary thinking decenters what he calls humanocentric thinking, Latour has qualms about the use of the terminology of the planet and the planetary to analyze the predicament that we are in. He writes, we must face up, literally, to what is a problem of dimension, scale, and logic. The planet is much too narrow and limited for the globe of globalization. At the same time, it is too big, infinitely too large, too active, too complex to remain within the narrow and limited borders of any locality whatsoever. Let me try to move fast here and summarize a little bit. For Latour, to judge from the standpoint of the globe, let's go back to this, is to judge things from far away as disposable entities for human intervention. But to view the Earth as one planet among others, as a falling body among other falling bodies in the infinite universe is not correct. If we try to think from the standpoint of the universe, he argues, we cannot comprehend the epochal transformations of our times. So Latour introduces yet another term, as you all know, Gaia, or the terrestrial, which he believes is another actor besides the global and the local. Now, Latour and Chakrabarty have had a conversation with one another in 2022 before Latour's untimely death. And the conversation is called "The Global Reveals the Planetary." For Chakrabarty, as we have seen, the concept of the planetary is an alternative to the concept of the global. But Latour suggests that the planetary itself is not an adequate standpoint. And they both come to an agreement that what they should call that significant biosphere, that they should call it the deep Earth. Okay? Now, this very, very important. And I mean, these are two major thinkers who are trying to understand and theorize for us the consequences of the Anthropocene for the human and social sciences. And they come to the agreement that what Dipesh may want to mean by the planetary, let's call it the deep Earth, the terrestrial, that critical zone. But what is the deep Earth? The use of this term shows that there is a slippage between epistemology and ontology, between the normative and the ontological. Latour says, and this is an important quote. Okay, I'm just repeating in this, yeah. The Earth, the primordial Earth, which has obsessed Husserl and Heidegger, and in some ways Schmidt and many other Germans, what would have been the agent of human history here? What would have been the political construction, the agent of history? End of quote. Now, I want to emphasize that this move towards the deep Earth, what I'm calling a kind of ontological essentialism, on the part of two thinkers who take the most recent developments in the earth sciences as their guidepost, is puzzling. Chakrabarty is fond of citing Heidegger's phrase that the opposition of Earth, the Erde, and world, the Welt, is ein Streif. It's a striving, particularly in Heidegger's analysis of political part. But Heidegger's phrase cannot be understood independently of his phenomenological ontology and all the additional commitments that this entails. First and foremost, Heidegger criticizes modern technology, which projects the world as Gestell, as a thing to be inframed for the sake of human manipulation and use. The kind of epochal reorientation in thinking, which Latour and Chakrabarty seek here, converges with a certain critique, not only of modern science and technology, but also of modern politics, as advocated by the well-known tradition of anti-modernist reactionary thought, represented by the philosophies of Heidegger and Schmidt. I would exempt Husserl from this characterization, who remained a humanist to the end. The Earth, the concept of the Earth, suggests an orientation, in Schmidt's terminology, in his famous work on legal philosophy, the Nomos der Erde in Jus Europeum. Okay? And for Schmidt, the Earth suggests an orientation, or what he calls an Ortung, which implies a primordial relationship between the people and the soil they inhabit. The law, he says, emerges out of the earth and is related to the earth. And this is the source of his basic disagreement with Kelsen, who said, look, the law is a product of human intellect and will, and does not emerge from the earth. I mean, I'm going over here quickly about certain theses, whereas the late Heidegger espouses a form of anti-humanism that rejects the deification of the human at the expense of being. Carl Schmitt's theory of the relation between earth and law in Jus Publicum Europaeum leads to a critique of the rootlessness of the Anglo-American seafaring modernity and of liberal law and human rights in general. Okay? So when one starts invoking deep earth, I think one has to have the responsibility of spelling out also what we're talking about in terms of planetary politics. Okay? The agent of modern politics is considered in this anti-liberal tradition not only as being entitled to life, liberty, and property in John Locke's famous phrase, but is considered also as a destructive agent. Okay? Now, why is the reactionary politics of the deep earth not discussed? What are the consequences of Heidegger's anti-modernism, and why are they not evaluated in the light of his anti-Semitism and racism? Why is Schmitt's critique of Anglo-American liberalism in the name of an ontology of the earth versus the sea not referenced? I'm not suggesting that either Latour or Chakraborty would endorse these political positions. But there are dangers and pitfalls in giving up the humanocentric position normatively and replacing it by the language of the deep earth. Behind apocalyptic critiques of modernity, there has always lurked the exclusionary politics of those others who are viewed as not belonging to the earth or who do not have roots in the earth, as in the phrase, rootless cosmopolitan. The resonances of such terminology with the reactionary movements of the past 2 centuries is hard to avoid. Okay, I now want to elucidate a sense of the globe as world by thinking with Arendt and Jaspers on the nuclear era. Arendt and Jaspers reflected on the perils of the nuclear age which preceded the climate catastrophe of our times. The climate change of our times brings with it ecological disasters, such as the heating of the earth and the oceans, the melting of the ice caps, extreme weather events, the depletion of resources, and the death of plant and animal species. But this is not the first time in history that an appeal has been made to humanity as a species, as a unified agent who is also a victim of its own actions. Humanity emerges in Adorno's terms as the subject-object of a negative universal history. Adorno calls this negative because these changes are not intended by human beings themselves. Although they are the agents who bring them about, they are also the victims affected by these changes. The period after the Second World War presented for many such a moment of negative universal history, when the consciousness of the magnitude of the destructive powers of humanity amassed by building the atomic bomb and the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became widely spread. These themes are addressed by Hannah Arendt in the Laudatio to her teacher, Carl Jaspers, called Carl Jaspers, Citizen of the World. Reading Arendt will also enable us to elucidate the concept of the world as distinct from Earth and planet more precisely. I also hope to show that through this reading of Arendt and Jaspers, that a positive sense of humanity as the agent of history can only be conceived as a plurality, that is, as human beings in plural, who strive towards dignity. Arendt delivered this laudatio when Jaspers received the Peace Prize of the German book trade, the Buchmesse, in 1958, after the publication of The Atom Bomb and the Future of Mankind. Arendt begins by rejecting world government and world citizenship, but concedes Kant's insight, quote, that mankind, which for all preceding generations was no more than a concept or an ideal, has become something of an urgent reality. For the first time in history, she continues, all peoples on earth have a common present. No event of any importance in history of one country can remain a marginal accident in the history of any other. Every country has become the almost immediate neighbor of every other country, and every man feels the shock of events which take place at the other side of the globe. And this common present, though, does not emerge from a common past, nor does it guarantee a common future. It is technology which has provided the unity of the world and can just as easily destroy it. You know, it's considered that Arendt never had much to say about technology, but this is one of the rare places where she does. Whereas the technology of communication has enabled the unity of mankind, the technology of mastering the forces of the universe through the splitting of the atom presages a destructive force which can end human life on Earth. This negative solidarity, based on the fear of global destruction, has its correspondence in a less articulate, no less potent apprehension that the solidarity of mankind can be meaningful in a positive sense only if it is coupled with political responsibility. But how can such negative solidarity become a sense of shared political responsibility? And here is Arendt's profound also realism, where she says, beyond political apathy, isolationism, nationalism, or desperate rebellion. Okay? It's not an easy task either politically or psychologically. Neither a world state nor world citizenship, in Arendt's view, can be solutions to this predicament. As I had already elucidated in my first lecture, Kant himself named a world state soulless despotism. But Kant is not willing to give up the ideal of world citizenship, neither am I, which for him meant precisely a sense of shared responsibility, in that the injustice done in one part of the world would be seen to affect all others. But Jaspers goes beyond Kant and Arendt in two respects, by giving the idea of world citizenship a more solid basis. First, through his philosophy of communication, and second, with his theory of the axial age. Universal communicability is possible precisely because its beginning lie in the axial age, when a common framework of historical understanding emerges. According to Jaspers' well-known historical reconstruction, which is now being revised and revived in some ways by Jürgen Habermas in his 2 volumes, and auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie, okay? And this is just, I'm mentioning this, it's not a central point, that according to Jaspers' well-known historical construction, something momentous occurs in human history in 5th century BC. With the emergence of Confucius and Lao Tse in China, the Upanishads and Buddha in India, Zarathustra in Persia, the prophets in Palestine, Homer, the philosophers and the tragedians in Greece. These worldviews all have in common that they discard mythology as well as religious cosmology and evolve towards the concept of a single transcendent God. Jaspers writes, as Arendt quotes him, the world history of humanity derives its structure from this period. And Arendt agrees that this is the moment when mankind first discovered the human condition on Earth. End of quote. Arendt draws a conclusion from Jaspers's observations on the axial age and world history, which resonates with Chakravarti's considerations above. For her, as for Jaspers, the emergence of mankind as a tangible political reality marks the end of that epoch of world history which began in the pivotal age, that is, the axial age. What begins now, after the end of world history, I'm going to go back, is the history of mankind. And Arendt here for the first time uses the term Menschheit. But this Menschheit, this history of Menschheit, which emerges at the end of that epoch of world history, is not a Gattungswesen, a species, as Feuerbach or Marx may have said, and Arendt drops the language of the species. The philosophy of mankind must not envisage man, and you know, her language is always masculinist, but we have to transform it. But it should not involve man as a singular subject talking to himself, rather human beings talking and communicating with each other. The human condition on Earth does not yet coincide, she says, with the dignity of human beings. The human condition is not a sociological reality and probably will never become one. It is rather the striving towards that ideal of humanity in all its plurality and diversity that paves the way for genuine solidarity. Arendt concludes, politically, the new fragile unity brought about by technical mastery over the Earth can be guaranteed only within a framework of universal mutual agreements, which eventually would lead into a world federated structure. And now, for those of you who are familiar with Hannah Arendt's work, there are interesting tensions as well as complementarity between Arendt's civic republicanism, her ideals of active and engaged citizenship, and her defense of federationalism, which always emerges as the alternative to the world state framework in both Arendt and Kant. What interests me here is that already in mid-20th century, both Arendt and Jaspers deeply reflected on the negative solidarity of mankind, which the new technologies of communication, as well as the realities of the atomic age, had given rise to. Arendt in particular emphasized human plurality and insisted that such negative solidarity must be transformed into some kind of worldly politics, in which universal mutual agreement, she said, lead to a world federated structure. She was less sanguine than Jaspers that such a federation would in fact emerge. For her, the destruction of European Jewry, whom she called the weakest link in the chain of Europe's nations, proved how difficult it was to construct a common world of institutions and practices, promises and commitments. Nonetheless, she admired political new beginnings, and in her clairvoyant essays on Zionism, which we should all reread now, she even advocated a Mediterranean unity of peoples as the solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. For Arendt, the world is between us. Es ist, was dazwischen steht, she says. It's like a table around which we sit and which unites us as well as divides us. Arendt's concept of the world is both indebted to Heidegger and subverts his categories. That Dasein is in the world is Heidegger's fundamental insight. That Dasein is not alone, and that Mitsein manifests itself through speech and action with others, that is not mere Gerede, as Heidegger says, is Arendt's fundamental contribution. Human beings inhabit the world always in the plural, in communities, in ethnicities, in demo. Arendt's laudatio is illuminating in one additional respect. After the disasters of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the use of nuclear weapons has been criminalized and prohibited. Although our age is one of great peril, when the nuclear arsenal of the superpowers still grows, and threats by Russia in particular about the potential accidental nuclear act like Chernobyl are thrown around, there is also a widespread consciousness about the dangers of using nuclear materials after the Fukushima disaster in Japan. In other words, there are institutions, legal constraints, and practices which human beings have instituted to prevent the worst from taking place. Can we do the same to restore the critical zone which surrounds planet Earth and which makes life possible? Again, how are worldly cosmopolitan politics possible in a planetary age? I'm coming towards a conclusion. My goal in these lectures has been to explore criticisms of cosmopolitanism in their various forms. Taking these critiques seriously, I have argued that it is still possible to argue for cosmopolitanism by disentangling it from the history of Western capitalism and the age of imperialism and colonialism. Kant's principles for perpetual peace through evident freedom are suggestive, but inadequate for building cosmopolitan institutions in our times. For this, we need to turn to the work of third world scholars of international law, as I argued in my second lecture, as they deconstruct and reconstruct concepts such as sovereignty, refugee, migrant, and possession over natural resources. I agree with Chakrabarty and Latour that we need a reorientation in our thinking to answer these questions. But I disagree with them that to achieve such a reorientation, we need to invoke ontologies of the deep earth and allow reactionary modernism in through the back door, whether wittingly or not. We need to rethink of the modern subject, not only as the Lockean proprietor, but in terms of human dignity, as a being who's a generalized and a complete other, as I've argued in other writings. Feminist theorists have long emphasized the need to view the human person as an embodied human being enmeshed in a web of relations and narratives with others. To this insight, we must now add the principle of ecological thinkers that we are embedded as well in the terra, in the web of life on this earth. Awareness of such embeddedness should not lead us, however, to mystify rootedness in nature, nor to construct primordialist mythologies of deep earth with unsavory political connotations. Albert Hirschman, in whose name these lectures are given, had recognized all this at a very deep level. Traveling across continents, countries, languages, and disciplinary boundaries, he left us a deeply humanistic legacy. His engagement in Central America and subsequently all of Latin America, and eventually India and Africa, inspired his major theoretical contributions, not only to development economics, but also to political sociology, social psychology, and cultural anthropology. He was interested in subverting paradigms of economic development prescribed to these countries by Western technocrats who pathologized backwardness humor. Instead, he was interested in endowing and surrounding the development story with a sense of wonder and mystery that would reveal it to have much in common with the highest quest undertaken by humankind. A consequence of viewing development and underdevelopment in this manner would be to modify our understanding of the economic structures of the West. In his evolution of scientific ideals, in this evolution of scientific ideals and models towards a different concept of development, there would be a dialectical reversal in that the otherness of the other would be reversed through the discovery of our community. In other words, underdevelopment would no longer be a pathology only. Hirschman not only rejected the economic fetishism of fuel fossil-based models of growth, but by valorizing indigenous resources and practices, he showed the way to a cosmopolitanism from below. This is a critique of Eurocentrism he shared with many other writers I have discussed in these lectures. I called for a project of democratic self-determination that can be embedded in a new law of interdependent sovereignties. Viewing the globe in its three dimensions as world, earth, and planet deeply affects this project. While liberal nationalists, whom I have discussed in the first and second lectures, apologies to those of you who are listening for the first time, but the book is coming. While liberal nationalists are right in insisting on jurisdictional accountability, it is clear that the climate change of our times deterritorializes the state, in that the consequences of actions and policies in one territory have deep effects on others. This situation has implications, or should have implications, for international law, which has remained state-centered. We need to extend international law more forcefully so as to litigate against corporations and companies who actively engage in deterritorialization and forum shopping by moving around the globe and shirking off their responsibilities to those who are their consumers and clients. We need to envisage new modalities of sovereignty as co-sovereignty. Climate change-based litigation has now been undertaken in over 80 countries, whether by way of human rights types arguments, as is recently the case in the Netherlands, or by way of measures to limit and control the actions of multinationals and other corporate actors. But legal politics alone is not sufficient. As the youth movements that have burst all over the world show, young people are creating a new politics through their activism and fantasy. That is, a new politics of planetary solidarity with life, which goes well beyond the formal agreements of politicians. My thesis in these lectures has been that we can enrich the politics of cosmopolitanism by integrating the three moments of the cosmos as world, earth, and as planet towards developing a worldly politics of human dignity. So thank you for listening.
Very much for this lecture. There's obviously a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure you all have lots of questions. We have a bit more than 20 minutes, if I understand correctly. We started a bit later, so this is going to be the schedule. But obviously, as a hobby political theorist who just does that as his job, and someone who's greatly interested in the topic, I'm going to ask the first question, and maybe that's going to kickstart a discussion as well. Let's see. I found it incredibly intriguing how you read the Latour and Chakrabarti, and I think it's, to me, was also a bit eye-opening how you engaged with them, because I have to say, I openly admit, and sometimes when I read Latour, I feel a bit stupid. I'm not sure I understand what he wants to tell us, really. I met him in person several times and asked him, and I'm not sure I understand better. And at the same time, I also acknowledge that there's a lot in it that is very intriguing, and a lot that we might learn from. I feel I never really understood the politics of it, and I think it's interesting how you paint the picture that also the commitment to deep earth seems to resonate with, you called it kind of a reactionary modernism. It also obviously, on the other hand, resonates with a highly sort of scientist view of the world, because everything is reduced to the natural in some respects. But I'm sort of sort of, I was wondering as you were unfolding these arguments whether the primary issue with the idea of the deep earth and the ideas behind Chakrabarti and Latour is this affinity with particular forms of reactionary politics, or whether it's actually a view that, at least on my reading, also really centers human agency quite a lot. Everything seems to be, at least on a strong reading, reduced to, what might say, instinct, maybe tribalism on the extreme. And in an odd way, it seemed to me that some ideas in there seem to even jar with reactionary politics, which was obviously highly agentive, right? You know, in its own way. Even avant-garde. I mean, certain forms of fascism, one might say, are quite the opposite of a view that reduces human agency to, you know, we're just animals. It actually has a vision that's greater than that. And so I was mainly wondering whether the deeper worry, perhaps, and I think that connects with Arendt so nicely, is that there's very little scope for beginnings in a view that reduces everything in a way to these deeper ontological positions that you've been laying out. And one might say that from that perspective, the affinity with reactionary politics is an additional reason to reject it, but maybe not even at the core of how I understood your argument to make that makes any sense. But I guess I still need to read more too.
It makes a lot of sense. Listen, I mean, maybe don't. I mean, this is my first extensive encounter with Latour, and I don't want to talk as a kind of Latour kenner here, but maybe what I bring to these texts is a training in German philosophy. You know, I practice the art of close reading, and I was really quite intrigued by this discussion because that they have, which is appended to one of Chakrabarti's recent publications. And at first I thought, this is a terminological soup. I'm getting confused. What is the planet? What is the globe? What is the deep earth? What's the crisis zone? What's the terra? And I said, why is there this terminological slippage? And I'm really not sure that they are at all saying the same thing. I mean, they are fellow travelers and they've been talking to each other at the University of Chicago for quite some time. And, you know, the fundamental insights that they share is the monumental significance of the Anthropocene, the need to rethink some of our fundamental categories. And then the confusion begins. I mean, you know, Latour is a scientist, and I have to defer to him as a scientist about this question of the very thin earth, which makes life possible. I mean, that's a scientific hypothesis. What Chakrabarti is concerned in is, now he's a historian, and he is now thinking about the question of, quote unquote, the history of the planet versus human history. I mean, he thinks that we are now for the first time in a position maybe to write the history of the planet, right? It's not always the same. And so these are his concerns, but I think you put your finger on the normative problem, namely the question of human agency. And Chakrabarti is quite sensitive to the paradoxes that some of his statements are creating. And I think he's also quite clear about, you know, how close, you know, I don't know if he's quite clear, maybe I'll retract this, but there is a continuous sort of citation, you know, here and there. He drops Heidegger. This quote, the other quote, and there is never, you know, or at least I have not seen a clear, you know, Auseinandersetzung. I mean, are you ascribing to late Heidegger's critique of humanism? Is that the same thing as your critique of the humanocentric? And if that's, the critique that you're sharing, how can, you have progressive politics? You cannot. And I mean, but one paradox that you pointed out is that whereas agency seems to become problematic for both Latour and Chakrabarty, that sort of the reactionary modernist movements were in some ways, I mean, they were forcing history. They wanted to go, where history would not. So there's also that nice problem which you brought out. But there are some other publications, late publications of Latour, where in fact I would say the nearness, the closeness, he keeps coming back and forth to Schmidt. And I don't quite understand if this is the classical French attitude of épater les bourgeois, or if there is something more serious, that is to say, more serious going on there. And that is really extremely important because, and let me add something here. The Jus Publicum Europaeum is a deep and brilliant work. I would be the last, to deny it. I think it's one of Schmidt's most important works. He was a brilliant international lawyer, and the history of international law that he gives in that work is brilliant and at the same time incredibly devious. Because the whole thesis of that is that there is a kind of nomos der Erde, right? That's the title of the book. Nomos der Erde in Jus Publicum Europaeum. What is the nomos of the earth? In the sense of law. And he tries to give this primordialist account of the emergence of law out of territoriality and territory. And the whole second half, the whole critique of the book is that the Anglo-American liberal tradition, which is of course identified with liberals, with Bolsheviks, and with Jews, we know this crap, okay? Or at least we should not forget, right? And then, what he does there with this is the whole liberal tradition is really not a terrestrial tradition, but a seafaring tradition, right? And so increasingly in Schmidt's later works, there is this contrast between das Land und das Meer, and the kind of, conflict and so on. But don't forget that behind this contrast, what's going on is a denunciation of liberal human rights and liberal humanism, right? And so that's why, I'm sorry, I get a little, as the expression goes, red under the collar, or my hair starts standing up, or something or other happens. But when we need to understand concepts like deep earth, and in this respect, what you were saying, Arendt is very different, and she insisted on the possibility of human agency. There can be no politics without human agency, right? And the human being is embedded in narrative, and yes, in that sense, Heidegger was right. We're always in the world, and there is always mid-sign, but without the agency, there can be no politics.
Wonderful. These are good last words, but of course, you have questions, so please raise your hand and maybe introduce yourself very briefly. We only have one microphone, so you're silencing me once and for all.
Hello, my name is Oliver. What you were saying at the end there, I think there's this problem of deep earth, going back to earth and ethnicities, and but I think there's also this kind of revival of the seafaring tradition, as you called it, with the whole space exploration thing that is driven by Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, where it seems to me that they, in a sense, want to escape cosmopolitanism, because, and it also, maybe that's a completely different point, but because they already have a cosmopolitan life in a way, because they can buy passports, basically, they can go wherever they want, enforce laws wherever they want, and maybe that's trying to escape cosmopolitanism for everyone. I'm not sure. Thank you.
That's fine, yeah, I understand.
Yeah. Yeah, just with an eye on time, we might collect, I think it was you.
Yeah.
And then we have another one.
Thank you. My question, I want to hear more about how communicative, and I'm sorry if this was in the last talk, I wasn't able to make it, but I want to hear, please, more about how communicative ethics relates to this, what you're doing in this talk, and particularly maybe in the way that negative solidarity, as our end calls it, the process between that becoming something like a planetary political project. And I also, in relation to that, wanted to hear more about the sort of, so you say that the Anthropocene is deterritorializing the state, but it's also in some ways, and maybe this was never undone, but it's making different temporalities, or different geographies also have very different temporalities in the Anthropocene in terms of where they're positioned in what's happening climatologically. And even in work following Wynter, people look at the Anthropocene at the beginning of modernity in 1492, not in the 1700s, and how does that framework relate to the sort of project of a planetary solution, or, yeah.
Good, okay, thank you. Interesting that you mentioned Musk and Bezos, because there is this attempt to leave the Earth behind. I mean, if I were to speak with Arendt, it's an attempt to leave the human condition behind, not just the cosmopolitanism. But it's also, at the same time, an extreme venture of capitalist entrepreneurship, isn't it? It's a projection now of the, the planetary, of the universe as an object, not just of discovery, but let's be serious, as an object of potential appropriation and exploitation, right? And I mean, it is like, in some ways you would have to invent Elon Musk if he didn't exist. I mean, he is the paradigm of all that is, of all that is wrong with, capitalist globalization. And I happen to believe that his satellites and everything should really be litigated against. I'm waiting for some process whereby the law says nobody should have this kind of power. Why the heck should you have the power to be able to control all of Ukraine's websites? Your power, why? Who has given him this power? And why are we so stupid and so fragile that that we don't do anything about it? Forgive me, I don't mean that we're stupid, but I mean the world's governments. I mean, is he going to buy them all off, or So I think it's a very good point that you make. I mean, in some ways you say, well, is he also a cosmopolitan? There I'm going to try to take an exception. There is this denigratory conception of cosmopolitanism, as a good American sociologist, Craig Calhoun, who's a friend of mine, but put it polemically, as the ideology of world travelers, right? And so now it becomes the ideology of cosmos travelers. But what I'm trying to argue in these lectures is that this is a caricature. There is and there has been another meaning of cosmopolitanism, both among the Greeks and the Stoics and the Cynics and Kant. And so in that sense, I'm also trying to rescue the word from that. But it's not a coincidence that you bring up Musk and Bezos, because they want to conquer, what of the planets. I mean, it is going to be the struggle for the future. It's going to be both a political and an ego struggle. No? I just don't believe that individual human beings should have that kind of power. Now, oh gosh. Let me pick up, on your second point, because that's a research project. When you say that deterritorialization should not just change our understanding of space, but also of time, and the whole question of alternative geographies, yes, and there are work attempts at that, but all I can say is that it is a research project to which I don't know if I'm going to be able to contribute, where my head is at. You've seen in these lectures. Now, communicative ethics and negative solidarity and so on. I'm going to try to give you a very brief answer, because the term communicative ethics obviously emerges out of Jürgen Habermas's work. Sometimes it's called discourse ethic, sometimes it's called communicative ethic, right? And the principle here is an attempt to try to reformulate the Kantian principle of universalizability, okay? And philosophers here act in such a way that the maximum of your actions can also be a universal law for all. Okay, we spend time, parsing this statement in all the various ways. And what Habermas has brought in through his philosophy of speech and intersubjectivity is to reformulate act in such a way that the maxim, the principle of your actions, can be a universal law for all in terms of communication in a discourse situation, so that I don't, as someone said, for Kant, morality sometimes is like what mathematicians do. You sit in a room by yourself and you try to solve the problem. And the whole idea in communicative discourse ethics is the capacity not only to take the standpoint of the other, but to engage in communication with the other. Now, there are a lot of philosophical issues about justification, and as you may know, Habermas talking about an ideal speech situation. What kind of communication? How close is this communication to everyday speech? How distant is it from everyday speech, etc.? What I try to do is I try to de-transcendentalize this position. And I try to remove the more extensive philosophical baggage that the discourse ethic comes in. And I'm trying to go here more, with Arendt's concept of enlarged mentality, but also not just see that as a kind of conceptual move in thought, but also in terms of sharing practices and world building with others. This is how I want to think of it. Now, negative solidarity is Adorno's word, and it's interesting that Arendt uses it in this essay as well. And what's meant by negative solidarity here is really we find ourselves in a predicament, and we are solidaristic with each other because of the worst that we have been put in. It is not a solidarity of a future project, of an anticipation. Okay? And so the attempt would be in the communicative ethics to try to give more of a sense of this project of human dignity, that we can share together. Very briefly.
Thank you so much. I know there was one more question. Is there anyone else who for the second round of questions. There's two.
I'm happy to take two. As long as my voice doesn't stop. Last time it stopped at 8 o'clock, but it doesn't seem to be today, so.
And you still have a question?
So, thanks. I'm really sorry now that I missed your first two lectures. If my question has already been answered in these lectures, just go on and answer the next one. My question would be about where you ended with cosmopolitanism from below. And when you recalled what Arendt's response was to the threat of nuclear destruction, she seemed to suggest something slightly differently, that you might call cosmopolitanism from above, a world federated structure, transformation of the international state system to cope with this huge challenge. Now, I was just wondering, don't you need a complementary vision of cosmopolitanism from below, also for the sake of addressing the magnitude of the challenge of the climate crisis, a vision how the international state system could evolve and ought to evolve in order to be credibly capable of addressing that kind of challenge, which is quite different in its nature from maintaining peace in a Cold War situation where the two sides have nuclear weapons. I was just wondering whether there is something that connects your vision of cosmopolitanism from below, emphasizing indigenous people's visions of the earth, social movements against climate change, etc., to a specific idea about what will be needed to change the international system. And let me just end by saying, it seems to be extremely difficult because the world might move in a different direction. It might be that many of our thoughts about the proliferation of human rights and cosmopolitanism in the sense of a universal form of democracy might have been tied to a specific epoch that was an epoch of neoliberal globalization that might come to an end if we are entering a new era of global power rivalry, of blocs consisting of the US, the EU, China, Russia, maybe India, that might find it much harder to engage in the transformation of the global institutional structures, the political structure that would be needed.
Yes. No, let me just answer really briefly, because I agree with much of his observations, except, of course, I mean, the first of all, I agree, Rainer, that cosmopolitanism from below came a little too quickly. At the end, what I had in mind there was what Hirschman, of course, also is talking about varieties of development projects. Yeah? And this is an issue because we cannot, I mean, how can we really engage in the conversation with what China has done, shall we say, stop? Don't develop. But on the other hand, there is also a sense in which it seems that that kind of rapid development really hurts the developing countries. And we see this. We see this in many ways. But there is a lot to be said there about ecology, development, and cosmopolitanism from below. I mean, there are movements, as you know, the most famous of which I think are in Lula's Brazil, that are trying to sort of put together some kind of ecological consciousness and development. And the kind of rapid model of development, that we have seen in China, and that is a world historical event, it is coming with a certain price. It is coming with a certain ecological denigration as well, the construction of the megacities, etc. There is an extensive literature literature on that. So I agree with you there. One has to sort of try to put the two things together. Now, about this language of superpower competition and the blocks, you know, it's almost like a return of the repressed, you know, Huntington's World Clash of Civilizations, except that right now, you know, the blocks are, you know, superpowers. Is that just an empirical assertion? And if it is an empirical assertion, are we at the same time committing ourselves to the proposition that we have to get rid of the UN, we have to get rid of the UDHR? What about all the, you know, human rights conventions? You know, Russia has exited the International Criminal Court before invading Ukraine. The United States first entered it and then exited. China erasing. I am not ready to give up all these normative institutions. I just am not, because I don't see anything positive that is being offered on the other side, and that's why I did go to the work of third world, you know, scholars of international law like Anthony Angie and Dai Achiume, who are trying to reconstruct and rethink these projects. And I think, you know, also that this is an eminently Kelsenian project. So I don't quite know, or if this is just an empirical description, or together underlying this empirical description also comes a whole normative theory of there is only big power politics, and that's all. Und dann was, right? So that's what I'm trying to argue against.
There's another question here.
To be continued. We've been good friends for many years, so I'm sure this will continue.
It's not dystopia, but it's possible.
Yeah. Is this on? Yeah, it is on. Okay. This has to be closer. Thank you very much for the talk. I'm trying to express some sort of a question out of a very sort of a lot of ideas and politics. I try to get something out. So my question would be about historicity and communication and community, especially in regards to the Germans that you were talking about.
In regards to
The German thinkers of Schmidt, Heidegger, and then also Heidegger and Jaspers and Arendt. Because what is so sort of seductive in the sort of Heideggerian and Schmittian idea is that it taps into this kind of very easy idea that I have a community, we have a shared history, and we share a world in this Heideggerian sense where we can all communicate with each other, and then it's easier to think that these people are my equals. Well, in the cosmopolitan idea, if there is no shared history in this sort of similar sense, as you also underlined, then there has to be this sort of, what you also explained, that Arendt sort of says that there is not shared history or not necessarily a shared future, but there is a shared present. And Jaspers also had some sort of a theory that explained why we can sort of communicate within like a global community or within like humanity as a whole, and there is like an idea of a humanity that has some sort of a shared something that sort of makes them a community. So I guess my question is something to the extent, do you think that there needs to be an idea of a global or like a history of the humanity, shared history of the humanity for cosmopolitanism to work? So that it's, or that communication is sort of possible within people, so that it's not just like a diversity that sort of disperses around, where communication is not possible anymore, or is it like, is there something that unifies humanity that is not based on something transcendental, but also is not based on sort of shared history in the sort of Heideggerian sense or in the sort of German 19th century sense? I don't know, this was a very long-winded question, but...
It's a big question, and I'm not sure that there is a question. I think you're thinking. I think you're thinking and trying to put certain kinds of thoughts together. I guess you're concerned about, if I hear you correctly, I think you're concerned about two things. One is, the question of communication, and the other is, the issue of shared history of humanity. I think the one question that I extracted from what you said is, does cosmopolitanism require a shared history of humanity? And of course, what Jaspers did was very classical Geschichtsphilosophie. Okay? So let me begin with that. We are constantly rewriting history. And we are constantly rewriting now in the scholarship. I mean, I can tell you, in all the years that I have read Kant and Hegel, and I've taught Kant, it is now that I'm beginning to see, through the work of some so-called postcolonial scholars, and I never asked myself this question. Which people did Kant have in mind when he talked about some elegant freedom? Who was capable of that? Who was not capable of it? I mean, the way I was taught philosophy, which I think maybe now you're going to be taught it differently, was that this is universal. You either accept the argument or you don't accept the argument. And there are elements of the argument that ought to be accepted, right? Genesis and validity are not the same. We shouldn't confuse them. But there is a kind of contextualization and rewriting of history that enriches our understanding. So this doesn't lead me to, get rid of the Kantian text, quite to the contrary. I mean, that's what I was showing in the first lecture. But there is an enrichment and this retelling, re-narrativization that is going on. In that sense, I mean, I find 19th century style of Geschichtsphilosophie today very difficult. Which work is that just on the great book on Hegel and this way. It's a very difficult task, and I have to admit to you, I mean, Habermas is my teacher, but I wrote a very critical review of the Auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie, because Auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie became Auch eine Philosophie der Geschichte, right? If you get my drift, for those who don't know German, that and yet another history of philosophy becomes a philosophy of history. So no, I am not committed to a philosophy of history in the 19th century sense. I don't even know how that is possible today, how it can be written, but we have to learn from each other. And that's why I don't believe in Chakrabarty's project of the history of the human species, quote unquote. Maybe the history of the planet could be done, and it seems as if people who do earth scientists, are doing that, and who am I to say that can't be done. Now, one more remark about communication. Communication is, as Adorno Patrick said, an earlier begriff, it's slippery, it's greasy, right? Everybody communicates with everybody, and there is a tendency to identify communication with transparency, right? And I mean, I've sort of laid the emphasis on one end of the equation in these lectures because I'm trying to recoup something. But communication is always miscommunication, is always misunderstanding, is always understanding differently. If there's one thing we have learned, you know, also from Gadamer, is that communication itself is also part of process of translation. Okay? So even if you speak the same language, translation is always involved. Understanding is always understanding differently. Now, these theses usually are taken to lead to a kind of postmodern critique of reason and so on. I don't see that. I don't see why we would have to go in that direction. And I think I'm quite happy with, you know, sort of hermeneutics, which teaches me that, you know, understanding is always understanding in context. Communication is always in communication in context, and I can never make completely clear to myself or to anyone else all the presuppositions I have in communication and understanding. So in that sense, you know, erweiterte Denkungsart, when Arendt talks about it, and she gets this from the famous discussion in Kant, paragraph 42 of Kritik der Urteilskraft, sensus communis, Gadamer goes back to it, etc. We just have to be careful not to think of this as a kind of, you know, sort of kumbaya, right? Because when we think of it that way, it becomes too facile, it becomes too easy, and it's too easy to dismiss it. So thank you that you brought out, you know, that, you know, you were thinking about these aspects, whether you intended them or not, but it's okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm afraid we're now really out of time. Thank you so much to all of you for coming, and thanks for your questions.